So today I'm going to answer a question that I got from Phyllis. She asks, what are the most effective ways of dealing with and resolving conflict? This is a great question and right down my alley. So I'm really excited to dig into this. Phyllis Levitt is an author and a psychotherapist for 30 years, like myself. She has a book coming out called America in Therapy, and it talks all about the social conflict that's going on in our country and how we can heal from it using techniques therapists use every day. You can get that book through the usual means, Amazon, Books a Million, or any other platform where they sell books. Let's talk about conflict, how to deal with it. There's three factors that go into a conflict. They are communication, neurobiology, and how you define the problem. I'm going to take each one of those separately. Okay, so first of all, communication. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when they are discussing something is they get sucked into what I call the content rather than the underlying dynamic, that is, what is going on between you and that other person. So I created this model, 15 principles of communication. And I'm going to just touch on a few of them so that you'll understand what I mean by dynamics as opposed to content. So the reason I call these principles and not skills for communication is because they address a context, that is, how people are relating to each other and what is going on internally that is getting in the way that the two of you are communicating. And so without understanding the context, you're just scratching the surface and you're going to continue to argue. And I call it same scene, different script, because what you're arguing over may change, but the underlying dynamic, which is how you're relating to one another, interacting with one another, is the same. So, one of my principles is what I call perception and intent. So, this is a roadblock that a lot of people run into. And I'm going to give you an example. So there's a couple that I was working with, and they got into an argument, and he had given her a Star Trek calendar because she loves Star Trek. And it was this an old calendar that he found somewhere, and he gave it to her. So they got into this argument, and she left the calendar there at his house. And so the way that he took that is it was like passive aggressive. Fine, I don't want your gift. So, a way of showing some sort of hostility. And so that was his perception. And we're going to run into the scenario where we have different perspectives. Happens all the time. That's not the problem. So, anyway, he thought she was being passive aggressive. She, on the other hand, did it because she didn't feel right taking the calendar since they had just had an argument. And to her, it felt like taking a gift under false pretenses. So there's perception and intent. His perception was that she was being passive aggressive, right? Now, just because that wasn't her intent doesn't mean that he's not entitled to feel the way that he feels, right? That's important because a lot of times we have good intentions. And what we do is we assume that if I explain myself, that other person's going to feel differently. And oftentimes that's not the case. And that's just human nature. So when you explain to somebody why you did what you did, thinking that's gonna change how they feel, what they're gonna hear is, "You're wrong for the way that you feel, and here's this really good reason why." So it's about understanding that perception and intent are both valid. It's not about right and wrong. Both are valid, and communication is reaching an understanding so that you can move forward and problem solve. That was his perception. And then we have her intent. So she had good intentions. And so you have this conversation about, oh, okay, that's the way that you saw it. I can understand it coming across that way. And what would you like me to do going forward? What do you need to hear from me? What would you have preferred I do or do differently? And then the other person, in this case, the guy in the relationship, would not jump to conclusions or make assumptions that the intent was malicious, because that's often what happens is people assume that somebody has some sort of malicious intent, selfish intent. They mean to hurt you in some way, or they don't care, they're insensitive. And a lot of times, I would say 98% of the time that their perception does not match what the intent was. And again, you have a right to feel the way that you feel. Just because you understand that wasn't the person's intention, that doesn't mean you don't have a right to feel, because you can understand something and still be impacted by it emotionally. So, in any case, but it's helpful in the future for him to say, before I make an assumption, I'm going to check in with the other person and not just assume that they're trying to be passive aggressive. So that's perception and intent. Another common roadblock is triggers. And this is just part of being human. Everybody has triggers. Everybody on the planet has triggers, different triggers for different people, but everybody has them. So, what is a trigger? A trigger is when something happens, somebody says something or does something, and what it does is it triggers an emotion. And it's an emotion that person has felt before under the same circumstances. And so then what happens is when the person is triggered, they're responding not just what happened in that moment, but all the other times they felt the same way. So I have a mantra. If I pour soda and coffee and orange juice into a pitcher, when I go to pour out the orange juice, the soda and the coffee are going to come with it, right? Can't separate them out. So that's what happens with triggers. So you might trigger somebody's feelings about something that happened to them growing up. All of those emotions come out because they're unresolved. So if you are aware that you have triggers and what they are, then you can be more deliberate and more thoughtful about how you cope with them in the moment when they come up. And be able to say, you know what? I'm aware that right now, what you just did or said triggered or reminded me of my past. So I might respond in a way that seems excessive for the moment, whatever happened, the person did or said. So if you can be aware of your triggers, then you can verbalize them and say, you know what? I'm aware that I'm being triggered right now. Maybe I should walk away, give myself some time to cool down. So I'm going to talk about two techniques. These are the only two techniques that are in my 15 principles of communication. The rest are contextual, explaining how psychology, what's going on with us internally, emotionally, cognitively influence the way we communicate. But if you just learn these two techniques, you're going a long way. So the first one is iMessaging, but it's my own version of iMessaging. Remember earlier when I was giving you the example of perception intent, and I talked about making assumptions. So this is where an I message can be really helpful. I'm going to use the example of this couple. Let's say instead of assuming that the girlfriend was being passive aggressive, he was to say, "When you left the calendar here, it hurt my feelings, but I don't want to make any assumptions. Was that your intent? Did you mean to hurt my feelings? Did you mean to give me a backhanded jab?" He's giving her an opportunity to explain herself because, first of all, she's going to do it anyway, because that's what people do. If you say, "I was bothered by this or hurt by this, or I don't appreciate the way you did this," the person's going to come back and want to explain themselves. And so what you're doing is you're giving them that opportunity to do that. You're anticipating and you're doing it before they do. So that way you are getting that roadblock out of the way. Secondly, it gives that person an opportunity to be heard, and it therefore avoids anybody making assumptions, and instead you work on trying to understand each other. The focus is not on winning or losing an argument. The focus is on reaching understanding. That's why we communicate. So the structure of the iMessage is when you did or said X, and X would be something that the person did or said that it has to be objective, something that is observable, not a characterization. So the boyfriend wouldn't say, "When you were acting passive aggressively." That right there is a characterization. Instead of saying, "When you left the calendar here," that would be something objective. An example that I often use was a couple that I was working with where she was talking to him and he didn't respond. And so she said, "Why are you ignoring me?" And he said, "I'm not ignoring you. I was taking a nap or resting or whatever." So by saying ignoring, she's implying an intent and characterizing his behavior. What the behavior was is he didn't respond to her when she was talking to him. And so what she could say instead is, "When you don't respond when I ask you a question or I'm talking to you, and just acknowledge that you hear me, I feel," and then that goes to the second part of the I message, the why. And the why, the letter Y, is a feeling or a perception. And it's really important to use feeling words because that is less threatening. So if you say, "When you didn't respond to my question, I thought that you were ignoring me or being insensitive." So those aren't feeling words. They are labeling, their characterizations. That's what happens a lot of the time is people start out with a why message, but then they turn it around and make it about the other person and they use you. "I felt you were doing this," or "I felt you were being that." So you want to be really careful that you stick to how you felt, right? Or what your perception was. And that way you avoid starting an argument because that person's naturally going to feel like they're being accused of something, that they're being criticized, that they're being labeled in some way. And that's going to generate some defensive response. So the second part of the I message would be, "When you left the calendar here, I felt hurt." Or when you didn't respond to my question, I felt ignored rather than you were ignoring me. And then the third part of the I message is different from what is traditionally done. So I have my own spin on it, and that is, um, but I don't want to make assumptions. So I'm checking in with you. Is that how you meant to come across, or is that how you actually feel? If we go back to when you left the calendar here, I felt hurt, but I don't want to make any assumptions. Was that your intent to hurt me? Or if when you didn't respond to my question, I felt ignored, was that your intent to ignore me? And sometimes it might be unimportant. I felt like my needs weren't important to you. Is that how you actually feel? So that would be another way of asking a question, depending on the context. So that's an I message. And when I was in the army, I taught these to soldiers to avoid domestic violence incidents. So this stuff can be very effective. And you want to think about when you're upset, what is it that you want most of all? You want to be heard. So you have to express yourself in a way that you're not going to put the other person on the defensive so that they're going to either get angry and start arguing back or they walk away. So that's what's in your control is how you communicate. Now, empathy is the other technique that I want to share with you. And empathy, I think, is often misunderstood. It is not a weakness. And it is not saying that you agree with the other person. I think of empathy as a tool. It's a way of gathering information so that you can reach understanding and then problem solve. If we go back to my first scenario with the calendar, so let's say that boyfriend did not use iMessaging and he said, that was really passive aggressive of you to leave the calendar here. So he wasn't communicating constructively. However, you can still respond in a constructive way. And the way to do that is through empathy. So empathy is really about gathering information. It's like being Columbo without the trench coat and cigar. So if you're familiar with the old detective show from the 70s called Columbo, he used to walk around with this rumpled trench coat and a cigar in his hand all the time, and he was always asking questions. That's what you want to be. You want to be curious. And so you ask questions like, what was I doing that gave you the impression that I was being passive aggressive? Help me to understand how you saw it. And so empathy is about wanting to understand where the other person is coming from, even though you don't agree with them. You won't agree. It's not about agreeing. It's about gathering more information so that you can understand that person's perspective. Remember, the goal here is to reach understanding, not to win an argument or to get the other person to see things your way. But if both people are making an effort to understand the other person, that's how you resolve conflicts. That's how you are able to problem solve because you get to a point where you say, oh, okay, I see what you're talking about. You see what I'm talking about. Where do we go from here? What have we learned from this experience so that we know what to do differently next time? So that's an example of empathy. Again, going back to the couple, if she said, why are you ignoring me? Instead of him saying, I'm not ignoring you, he could say, okay, what is it that I'm doing or saying that's making you think that I'm ignoring you? Just want to understand, just want more information. Doesn't mean that you agree. Communication is more complicated than you think. If it were easy, you would have figured it out already. But it's really learning a new language, and it's something that you have to learn. It does not come instinctually, and that's one of the unfortunate side effects or consequences of us not talking about mental health, is that people aren't learning how to communicate constructively, and we're seeing it not just in our personal relationships and working environments, but we're seeing it politically, socially, right, in our country, and it's very self-destructive. But if you think about how powerful diplomacy can be in bringing peace, for example, to warring countries, that gives you an idea about how powerful communication is. The next factor in avoiding conflict is understanding something about the way human beings think and process emotion, how the brain works essentially. We are hardwired to feel before we think. So our feelings are in one part of the brain called the limbic system. And then thinking skills like reasoning and emotional regulation and thinking about consequences of your actions, that's all in the prefrontal cortex. Mm. So when we're in a heightened state of emotion, like anger or high anxiety, right? We are not in the prefrontal cortex. We are over here in the limbic system, right? And so if you want to be able to reason with somebody, then you need to get them out of emotion mind and into rational mind. So what does that mean? That means that you have to find a way for each of you to calm down, because until they are calmer, the rational mind is not going to be able to take over. It's not going to be able to have any effect on emotion mind. A great analogy. The picture of a car, the inside of a car, and the panel where all of the instruments are. But behind the steering wheel was a dog. And the whole point behind this is to say that you can have all of the instruments that you want. All of this car could do a lot of different things, but it's not going to help if the dog is driving it. Similarly, whatever coping skills we have are not going to work if we are still in a heightened state of emotion. So, when you think about what's going on in our country, one of the things that politicians do, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is they try to generate anger in their voters because they know that anger is a very energizing emotion. The problem is that it's not just energizing, it's also irrational and it's impulsive, right? It's an emotion, so it's going to be irrational. We evolved to experience anger in order to protect ourselves from danger. So it gives us a lot of energy and strength in an instant, and it's very impulsive. If somebody's about to hit, our brains are not meant to be in a state of anger constantly, day in and day out. And that's what's been going on in the country is people are staying angry. They're staying in emotion mind. You've got a dog behind a steering wheel. It's just not thinking logically. Some other things about the brain that go into how we interact with one another is understanding that we have to trust the other person in order to take in the information they're giving us. We evolved to only listen to people that we trust because that was a survival mechanism. And if you don't trust somebody, then you're certainly not going to receive what they have to say with an open mind. That seems like it's pretty common sense, right? But it's important to remember that is the way our brain is wired. When you're trying to talk somebody into seeing something differently, remember that you have to build trust first. We also retain information when we're in a good mood. We have memory neurons, which are activated when we're happy. And so, if you want somebody to listen to you and retain the information that you're giving them, and not just going one ear and out the other, you have to, and then you can get into reasoning and problem solving. Then the last factor in avoiding conflict is how you define the problem. Too often, what people do is go straight to solutions. Then they find themselves between a rock and a hard place, or they're indecisive. Should I do this or should I do that? Because they're focusing on solutions. The first thing that you want to do is identify what is the underlying need. As human beings, we all have the same basic needs. And so when you get down to the needs, then it's easier to problem solve and it's easier to find agreement. But it takes some awareness of what the difference is between a need or the underlying problem and a solution. I have an example. This was some parents that I was working with, and they had very different parenting skills. So she believed in being stricter, and he didn't want to undermine the relationship with his kids or grow up in the kind of environment that he grew up in that was stricter. So, anyway, they had different parenting styles. And what I pointed out to them is I said, that's great because both of those styles have their strengths and you can work together. But they would argue over how to solve a problem that they were having with their kids. So one of those was age old problem of getting the child to do homework. They go straight to solutions, reward consequences, take away his video games until he does his homework. Do we check in on him or make him do his homework out in the living room where we can keep an eye on him? Do we touch base with his teacher to check if he had homework or not? All of these solutions come up. But what is the underlying need? The underlying need is that they want their son to grow up to have a successful, happy life. That's something that they can agree on. They both want that for their son. And that's the way most parents are. They want what's best for their children. They just don't always agree on how to get there. We don't want to say homework doesn't matter, but it's not really about the homework. It's about the underlying way the child is coping with having to do something he doesn't want to do, or it's difficult, or it's overwhelming. So, most of the time, the things that parents struggle with is really about how their kids are coping with their emotions. And so, what I try to teach parents is to focus on the emotion and the bigger picture. I get it that you don't feel like doing homework. There's times when I don't feel like working or going to work or doing stuff around the house or whatever. What do you do? How do you motivate yourself when you don't feel like doing something? And so that the child then learns more than whatever's in the homework assignment. They learn how to cope when something is hard, how to cope with a hard situation, a challenge, right? And they're gonna have that all through their life. The feeling is going to repeat itself over and over again. It may not be about homework, it may be about work when they're older, or it could be about something that they have to take care of in the family. Whatever it is, that emotion is the same. And so you are empowering your children to learn how to cope with emotions when you focus on helping them to deal with whatever it is keeping them or preventing them or causing the problematic behavior. So you want to focus on the feeling behind the behavior. And the thing that I tell parents is that there's no such thing as a wrong or bad feeling. It's how you cope with those feelings. And the only thing that's off the table is avoiding and giving up. So as parents, we can tell them, I will help you if we can work on this and overcoming whatever it is that you're feeling about these homework assignments or whatever it is that's troubling them, except for avoiding and giving up. And so if you start with them teaching them that now, how to cope with their emotions now, you will make your job easier in the long run, and you will be empowering your children to make better decisions. So, focusing on the needs is one way of how you define the problem. Another thing is you want to treat the problem as external. In other words, it's you and me, and the problem is out there. We're working together to solve this problem. But the problem is not between us, it's out there. And we're working together. How are we going to solve this problem? So you want to align with the other person, whether it's a child or an adult or work colleague or whatever. Too often, what people do is they align with the problem, they defend the problem, like homework. You've got to do your homework, and here's the reasons why you have to do your homework. And so then what happens is automatically you've put yourself in a power struggle between yourself and that other person. So instead, you want to align with the person and problem solve together. Let's think about this. What are some options? What's in your control? What's in my control to solve this problem? And you can also validate, again, you can always validate the feeling. Like, yeah, this is really frustrating. I wish we didn't have to deal with this problem, but we do. Or, yeah, I've had this problem too. And I know it's really hard to deal with. So you can validate the feelings, right? And normalize them and then redirect and then problem solve. What's in your control? Right? There's lots more I could say about this. I do have 15 principles of communication. And if anybody's interested in learning more about that, just comment in the chat. If you have any questions that you want me to answer, please do put them in the comment section. Take care.